Hi everybody, Rob Mize here again. I had this project that included a number of different charts and graphs, and I kept thinking there must be a better way to calculate these values. So thanks to the generous expertise of other After Effects users, I came up with some expressions that I found useful, and I hope you will too. There's a lot to get through here, so let's get started with something really basic, a percentage bar graph. Here in our first composition, bar graph percentages, I have a couple of different bars, a title and a pre-comp background, which if we open up, reveals several solid layers that create a grid background with a vignette. Back in our main composition, we could use a stroke effect on a solid layer to create the bars. However, I prefer to use a shape layer because you have more options, including different caps, tapering, dashes, waves, color gradients, and more. I used a simple click and shift click to create a vertical stroke and added a generate fill effect to color it and a bevel alpha and a drop shadow effect to add a bit of dimension. I'll add a trim path operator and notice the start and end settings are percentage values, so we could just enter a percentage value here. But since this tutorial is about expressions, we'll add a slider control and name it Enter Percentage. A quick note here. If I reference the Option key on my Mac, that's the Alt key on a PC. A reference to the Mac Command key equates to the Control key on a PC. Hopefully making this point one time is sufficient because you wouldn't believe how this upsets some people. So let's Option-click the Trim Path End stopwatch and pick whip that to the Enter Percentage slider control to link these settings by expression. Click the stopwatch and add a 0% keyframe and use Command-Shift-Right cursor to move 10, 20, 30 frames forward. Change the percentage to 100 and now the bar animates from 0 to 100%. Use Command-D to duplicate this layer and create a second bar. Shift-drag that to the right, change the value to 75% and change the fill color. Use Command-D to create a third bar. Shift-drag it to the right, change its value to 50% and let's change the color. Again, use Command-D to create a fourth bar and shift-drag it to the right edge of our grid. Change the value to 25%. And here's a cool tip I picked up from a tutorial by Ron Stern. If you hold down the Control key and scrub the fill color chip in the timeline, you can change the color right there. And this works on any color chip, but only in the timeline, not in the effects panel, only in the timeline. Now let's clean this up by selecting our 4 bar layers and in the Align panel, click Distribute Layers horizontally to space all our layers evenly. And there you have it, just about as simple as a bar graph gets. But what if we want to use decimal numbers instead of percentages? Here in our bar graph numbers composition, we see our bars have the same effects. However, we've named this slider Enter Numbers, and we've added a linear wipe. Notice if I change the value of bar 1, the other bars change accordingly because their values are tied to bar 1. Bar 1 itself doesn't change because whatever its numerical value, it's 100% of the bar and the reference used by the other bars. Changing the value on the other bars, however, only affects that bar, not the others. So let's see what's going on. In the interest of time, I'll avoid excessive detail regarding these expressions. You can just copy and use them if you like, or study them more closely for a better understanding of how they work. Some are a bit complicated, so feel free to leave me a comment requesting further detail. But if I could figure these out, I bet you can too. We'll use this expression to convert our slider number to a percentage of the value in bar 1. On this chart, we add a linear wipe to animate the bars. If we animated them with the number slider, the expressions would result in 0 being divided by 0, which is undefined and wrecks the mathematics we're using. Now let's see how we use expressions to create a pie chart. First, using percentages. These layers are circle shapes, each with a slider control named Enter Percentages, a fill effect to color our slices, and a radial wipe effect to create the slices. We can reorder these slices, and by adjusting the start angle of the bottom slice, we can rotate the entire chart. One thing to note is that these percentage values add up to 100%. Less than that leaves this open space. More than 100%, and the chart overlaps itself, and of course that's not right. So like most pie charts, the values here equal 100%. If we hit UU to open up a slice, we see the transition completion is linked by expression to our percentage slider and is subtracted from a value of 100. Why is that? If we solo this layer and remove the subtraction from the expression, we see our enter percentage of a 10% value reveals 90% of the circle. This is because the radial wipe percentage relates to the transition off, not the transition on. So by subtracting the enter percentage value from 100%, the resulting 90% transition offsetting leaves 10% of the circle visible. I've also changed the wipe setting to counterclockwise to place the slice on the right side of the pie. So that determines the size of our slice. The start angle determines its position using this expression that does two things. It uses index plus 1 to refer to the layer beneath it, and multiplies its percentage value by 3.6 to convert it into degrees, since 360 degrees equals 100% of a circle, and then adds that value to the start angle of the layer beneath it to position each slice accordingly. Now, since our background layer beneath bar 1, the index plus 1 doesn't have the effects referenced in the expression, so we get an expression error. And in this case, that's okay because the expression is disabled, which leaves bar 1's start angle at 0, and we can then change that to whatever we want and adjust the entire chart. In this composition, I've also added an adjustment layer with a radial wipe to transition the chart on or off, and also a CC spotlight effect just to give some illusion of some shape. Now, if we want to use decimal values rather than percentages to create a pie chart, it gets a little more complicated. So let's take a look and see what's going on here. We have a slider control named Enter Number and a fill effect to color the slices. Here's the radial wipe to create our slices and determine their start angle. And notice we've added a second slider named Total Number. This provides a running total of the values on each layer, with a grand total on the top layer. This provides a reference that the expressions use to adjust the slices whenever any value is changed. Here in the radial wipe transition completion, this expression converts our transition off to a transition on, and converts the value to a percentage of the grand total number of our values, which is found on layer 1, not slice 1, but the top layer, layer number 1. Again, the start angle uses this expression to refer to the layer beneath it to determine its value. This expression is different from the one we used for percentages because now we're calculating decimal values. And here, the inner number of each layer is added to the total number of the layer beneath it, that is, the index plus 1 layer. This gives us a running total with a grand total on the top layer, or layer 1. Because all the slices refer back to the total number of the slice on layer 1, and since they all have the same expressions, we can change the value of any one of these slices and the other layers adjust accordingly. And we can use Command D to create additional slices and then change the color, and the expressions calculate the results. Now this null is here just to give this bottom slice an index plus 1 layer for the expressions to refer to. If we delete the null, you see what happens. The expression is dividing 0 by 0, which is undefined at an indeterminate form, and our chart doesn't work properly. So let's undo that and get our null and our chart back. Now these color bars are all rectangle shapes and are calculated similarly to our pie charts, but with a few key differences. Instead of calculating the transition completion and the start angle, the color bar chart calculates the X position and X scale of each bar. The first thing to notice is the anchor point has been moved to the left center edge of each rectangle shape, and that's critical for what we're doing. If we create a new rectangle and change its scale on the x-axis, we see it scales from the center, but we want it to scale from the left edge. So hit Y to get the anchor tool, hold down Command, and drag the anchor point to the center of the left edge where it snaps into place. Now any change in scale will occur from this point. Let's delete this example and take a look at our expressions on bar 2. Since the scale parameters are percentages of the comp size, this expression directly applies the enter percentage value to the X scale. First, right-click the position setting and notice that we've clicked Separate Dimensions, so we can use the X position in our calculations independent of the Y position. The expression converts the enter percentage value of the layer beneath it and multiplies that by the composition width, in this case 1920 pixels. Then multiplies that by 0.01 to convert that percentage to a decimal value. Then it adds that to the enter percentage from the layer beneath it. This places this layer precisely at the right edge of the layer beneath it. With the same expression on all the layers, you can reorder them however we like. You can then parent your layers to a null and scale the chart as you see fit. Now take a look at the color bar's number composition, which, like our pie numbers chart, has a total number slider added. And if we reorder the bars or change their values, the other bars adjust accordingly. So we can use Command D to add more bars and just start plugging in numbers and change their colors to distinguish them from the other values. Let's hit UU to see how all this is happening. Here, we're adding the enter number of the layer to the total number from the layer beneath it to keep a running total. To determine the X scale, the expression calculates the enter number percentage of the total number in our top bar, which in this case we've specified as layer 2, because the title text is layer 1. Again, the expression refers to the composition width, and the layer beneath it, index plus 1, to determine the X position and the X scale of the layer. Now what I like to do is animate bar 1's enter number value, then drag the comp into this composition icon to create a pre-composition, rotate that by 90 degrees, add a CC cylinder effect, make a few adjustments to create something like this. And finally, my modest little masterpiece, our line graph. I tried so many approaches to this, but here's what I eventually settled on. First, the grid and then the line graph animate on and are tracked by running numbers that show the values plotted on the graph. So let's see what's going on here. First, we have our background and title text. And this solid layer is using particles from CC Particle World to draw the plot line. Our particle effect has a birth rate of 10 and 20-second longevity, so our particles last throughout the composition. If you've seen my other tutorials using nulls to position the particle producer, you may be familiar with these expressions. Since CC Particle World Producer measures position differently than your standard After Effects layer, these expressions resolve that difference. Once emitted, we want our particles to stay in place, so all our physics settings are set to 0. And I'm using a lens convex particle, so I've added a fill effect to color the particles. To give our line some dimension, I've added a layer style to add a drop shadow and a bevel embossed to our line of particles. We could have used effects, but the layer style offers a few more options. Now the null particle controller has an enter numbers slider and a max value slider. Let's look at the expressions we're using. I've separated the position dimensions, and these keyframes on the enter numbers slider are linked to the Y position parameter. If I delete the keyframes on the enter numbers slider control, the X position keyframes animate the particle producer in a straight line from left to right. Use Command Z to undo that delete and restore the enter number keyframes, which are linked to the Y-axis of the null to plot the value on the Y-axis by means of this expression. Now this composition measures 1080 pixels vertically, 0 at the top and 1080 at the bottom, which is exactly opposite of how we want our slider values graphed. We want 0 at the bottom and 1080 at the top. So in our expression, we divide the enter numbers by the max value slider, which determines a range for our null position to produce the particles on the Y-axis. This part of the expression creates a top and bottom margin for the comp, and this part determines on the graph where the 0 value lies. Finally, we subtract that product from the comp height to flip the plot vertically so that 0 values are at the bottom of the graph and increase as the graph plots upward. So that's what's happening with all this here. This text layer is linked to the slider value on the particle controller. And then we've edited the expression to limit the number to only 2 decimal points. Without that, you can get some really long numbers. So let me undo that delete to get back to only 2 decimals. And I've also tied the fill color of the text to our particle fill. Then we parent these numbers to the null particle controller and adjust the position to suit us. So at each keyframe on the slider control, we enter a value. If we change that value, you'll see the graph plot and the numbers change accordingly. And it's just that easy to plot. If the numbers you plot extend off the composition or don't fill up the space the way you want, you can adjust the Y scale of the graph by changing the max number slider. So I admit I developed something of an expression obsession to puzzle all this out, but it's proven to be quite a time saver and enabled me to take care of my charts and graphs in pretty short order. And I did learn quite a bit about expressions. I realize this tutorial has been somewhat exacting and perhaps even a bit tedious, but I hope it's helpful to see these expressions and get some sense of how they drive the creation of these graphs and charts. So I really appreciate your time and interest and hope you feel it was well spent. So until next time, this is Rob Mize wishing you happy compositing.